Can you imagine a world without Google? I mean, you wouldn't be able to Google terrible videos like this.
Imagine a world without Google. A world where you couldn't do detailed reconnaissance on your blind date for tomorrow night. A world where you couldn't find out with the click of a mouse the GDP of Kazakhstan.
Oh my God, that's horrible. Hang on. I grew up in a world without Google. It was fine. I went outdoors, I had a tan. Not once did I worry about the GDP of Kazakhstan. I didn't even know there was a Kazakhstan. You know, I was happy. Today, we Google everything. But a recent showdown with the federal government has meant our ability to Google has been under threat. So, what's been happening?
Google says it will shut down its search engine in Australia if it's forced to pay news outlets for content.
The government of Prime Minister Scott Morrison argues that since Google profits from linking to news providers, the search engine should pay for the journalism.
Google says the law would set an untenable precedent. Australian lawmakers, meanwhile, have called the company's position blackmail and bullying.
It's a classic David and Goliath tale, where Goliath is pretending to be David. David is backed by a consortium of multinational media interests. In the red corner, she knows what you searched last summer, the managing director of Google.
If this version of the code were to become law, it would give us no real choice but to stop making Google search available in Australia.
And in the blue corner, the prime battler himself, Scott Morrison.
Australia makes our rules for things you can do in Australia. That's how things work here in Australia. And people who want to work with that in Australia, you're very welcome.
Gee, he loves saying Australia.
We don't respond to threats.
Yeah, we will decide the news that comes to this country and the algorithm that calculates the priority with which it comes. The government want to make companies like Google pay news outlets for listing their content. Why? Let me explain. This is a typical Australian newsroom, and as you can tell, the place is humming. This is Susie. She's a Walkley Award-winning journalist who's written on everything from the COVID-19 pandemic to Scott Cam's beach body workout. She is the most experienced journalist in this whole newsroom and a real asset to the country.
Thanks.
You're fired.
What?
Go on, rack off. You see, if you Google Susie's article about the recent Russian protests, you'll see this summary, these headlines, bits of these articles, and all of these pictures, which, as we know, are worth 1,000 words.
I wrote that.
Now, each of these has been pulled off a news website who had to pay a photographer or a journalist to make them. Sorry, former journalist. You see, Google is using other people's work to bring you the news without you ever having to leave Google. And they're getting better at it. Half of Google searches now end without the user ever leaving the Google results page, which means the clicks and the cash stay with Google. So now, for every $100 spent on online advertising in Australia, Google gets 53 of those dollars. And all of that sweet ad money that could have supported this newsroom and Susie's young family now goes to Google instead. And that adds up to a lot of money.
Where does the bulk of the revenue come from in Australia?
So the bulk of revenue is from advertising.
Yeah.
4.3 billion from advertising.
Google generated $4.3 billion in Australia in 2019, all from those silly targeted ads that definitely don't work. All while paying, paying only 1.4% of that in tax. Google says they shouldn't have to pay news organisations because they're just recommending sites. And to prove it, they've brought out the big guns. Boring corporate PR videos.
Let me try and say it another way. Imagine your friend asks for a coffee shop recommendation. So you tell them about a few nearby so they can go and choose one and go get a coffee. But then you get a bill to pay all the coffee shops simply because you mentioned a few of them.
It's kind of like that, except instead of just mentioning the cafes, Google gives people a free sip of coffee from each one of them. And once they've got their fix, they decide they don't need to go to a cafe anymore. Google wants us to think it's a window to the world, but in reality, it's just an increasingly closed shop. The coffee shop analogy didn't win over the public, so Google has had to go direct to media companies and negotiate how much they're going to pay them. Which means for now, Google might be saved, so Australians won't have to imagine a world without Google. No, seriously, a world without Google. My Alta Vista shares will finally be worth something. I'd have to radicalise my own kids. I'd have to use Apple Maps, which is fine. And I'd know the GDP of Kazakhstan because a journalist would be paid to write about it, which sounds good. It all sounds quite good. I'm going to go Google an alternative to Google.